Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today we're off on a little bit of a tangent because we're talking to Rukhsana Koser, Legal Director at Enable Law, and Sarah Palmer, a partner at Enable Law, about the role that lawyers who specialise particularly in special educational needs play in the family law community. Great to have you both on the podcast to share your expertise. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for inviting us.
As part of the podcast, we invite our guests to tell us about themselves and their roles. So perhaps in the first instance, Rukhsana, you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Well, I'm a solicitor and I specialise in education law, but more particularly special educational needs. I got into this actually quite by mistake in that I went to an interview years ago at a firm in Stroud and heard all about special educational needs law. I thought, gosh, that's interesting. So I grew up with three siblings who had quite severe special educational needs, learning difficulties, and also some physical difficulties as well. So it was quite fascinating to find out that there was an area of law dedicated to it. And of course, I'd seen the struggles my parents faced. So it became of interest to me. I now care for two of the siblings because my parents have passed away. Now I have well over a decade of experience in helping parents secure appropriate special educational provision for their children, and that includes social and health care as well. And I am very committed to continuing to do this and making sure that the children receive the support that they're entitled to by law so that their needs can be met in this very challenging time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rukhsana. And Sarah, over to you.
I've been practicing as a solicitor for well over 30 years, and I have a slightly unusual background in that until October 2023, I was a dual family lawyer and also a special educational needs lawyer. In terms of my family law experience, I was a member of the children panel for many, many years, probably over 20 years, possibly longer, dealing with public law care proceedings, adoption, secure accommodation, and also private law Children Act matters, probably at the more complex end. So I'm somewhat unusual in the sense that I have dual experience and expertise in relation to family law and SEN. And over the years, I've dealt with many cases where there have been both educational components and also family components. In October 23, I moved to Enable Law, and from that time I've been almost exclusively dealing with education and SEN. The workload really became too much to kind of juggle both.
And is it a specialism particularly of Enable Law that you are special educational needs specialists and recruit individuals to your team?
I think special educational needs law is quite niche, and obviously Enable Law have a team now that specialise in that area. However, Enable Law does have a practice in other areas as well, including medical negligence, mental capacity, court of protection. So there's a lot of other areas of law that you can link with special educational needs. It's not the only area of law, but it's certainly a group of various areas of law that actually interlink quite nicely with each other.
Well, let's dive into that then. So we've talked about the fact that it's unusual, I guess. It's a bit of a tangent for the podcast to be talking to people like yourselves on this topic, but increasingly you have a role to play in family law proceedings. Can you kind of talk to us about what that looks like, particularly when it comes to advocating for children's educational rights and supporting parenting agreements, that kind of thing?
So with children with SEN, when you have family law proceedings going on, they often fall through the cracks in terms of, the dispute that's happening. We feel that we can support family lawyers in terms of what provision should legally and be practically be placed for the child, particularly if there's a dispute over parenting arrangements or there's local authority involvement. We can help make sure that educational entitlements are upheld during family proceedings, especially when disputes over schooling or support services arise. So, if parents move, one parent lives in another area, the other in another area, then of course, we can help actually make the decision and we can help support the process of deciding where the child will be educated. So when there's disputes often directly impacting a child's education and well-being, we can help with prioritising the child's educational stability and ensure access to the necessary resources where appropriate. School placement or therapy services are required, really. And also we can help with coordinating services as well, because a lot of people can get involved in the lives of especially children with SEN. So, we can ensure that we assist the various professionals involved to focus on what the support the child needs, particularly when there are complex family situations. And often there are lots of complexities involved when it comes to a child who has special educational needs.
And I think perhaps if I could just give a couple of examples of where practically, as a dual family lawyer and SEN lawyer, I've been involved in supporting family cases. One was where there was a significant dispute, primarily around how much time the child should spend with the non-resident parent. But as part of that, it became apparent that the child had special educational needs. The mother had applied for an education, health and care needs assessment. Father didn't really recognise that the child had special educational needs and was struggling with that. There was a dispute as to which school the child went to, and we actually needed to make an application to the court for a specific issue order for the judge to determine which school should be named and which school the child should go to. And that was running alongside a tribunal appeal to the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal. And because the client found me, I was able to deal with both aspects of the claim. If we then turn over to the public law sphere, there have been many sets of care proceedings where I've been instructed by a children's guardian to represent the child, where there has been a significant educational component. And again, I've assisted the court in terms of advising on what the legal requirements of the local authority are, who are there making an application for a care order, but the children's services team have very little knowledge invariably of SEN, and we've been able to guide the local authority to talk to their colleagues in SEN. We've been able to tell them what the criteria is for getting an EHCP. And in some cases, with the support of the judge and the parents, we've actually got a specialist residential school for the child. And that is where they have gone to live rather than in foster care. That's because of the knowledge that I have had and people I've worked with and professionals involved. There have also been many cases where we've been able to instruct specialist educational experts in family cases, particularly in the family law sphere, where we've been able to have them funded by the child's legal aid certificate.
What we're seeing increasingly in family law, and it's through initiatives like collaborative family law, is a recognition that as a lawyer, we don't know the answer to all of the questions. And so we are starting to bring expertise into the matter. And I'm thinking specifically in the case of divorces, you might have a divorce coach, for example. You're starting to see pension specialists really support the proceedings. Is this a similar scenario that you are increasingly becoming involved because there is a recognition by the law that, as you say, this is a very niche area that you can add a huge amount of value to?
I think so. I mean, in the sense that, when you either your child has or may have special educational needs, and they're facing difficulties in the school, then I think if a family lawyer is aware of those difficulties, they can approach us to help assist with guiding them through the process that needs to happen. SEN and educational disputes they're quite fraught as well. In a sense, and if you're already in a situation where the family is separating and decisions are being made around children, it's something that in terms of us, we can help actually make sure that we can deal with that aspect of things and advise accordingly, so that the parents are actually aware of their rights, and just not leave it for something that they can deal with alone on their own.
And I think I would add to it and say I think there's a huge role for lawyers like us to be brought in by family lawyers to advise on a consultancy basis or an ad hoc basis in terms of what steps can be taken within a case to support the family. And again, certainly historically, when I was practicing as a public law care lawyer in Hampshire, I would receive regular calls from other lawyers, my opponents in some cases, sometimes just other lawyers that I knew who knew about my expertise in SEN, who would just phone, who would pick my brains, and I would give them a steer. And I think historically, I haven't seen a huge number of family lawyers formally instructing an SEN specialist, but I think it's the way to go in the future. And I think it's certainly something that family lawyers dealing with a case where there are significant SEN issues should be thinking about.
We've done podcasts recently with people like intermediaries and, as I say, divorce coaches and mediators. The thrust of a lot of those discussions is educating practitioners about the role and skill that they have and their role in supporting the family lawyer, for example. And I think that's where you're driving at here, Sarah, isn't it? That an element of this podcast, for example, is helping family practitioners to understand what a SEN lawyer actually is and how they can help and add value to the case.
I think that's exactly right. And Rukhsana and I will have many, many examples where when families come to us in the first instance, their child is out of school because their needs are not being met. Parents who are trying to work, perhaps juggling a matrimonial breakdown or separation, are tearing their hair out. They've got other siblings, they've got this child, they just can't get that child into school. And one of our roles is supporting parents in firstly fully understanding what the issues are. Perhaps the fact that they just haven't got a naughty child who's struggling to go to school, but they might have a child with undiagnosed autism, who can't cope with the sensory overload within a school environment, who needs smaller class sizes, etc., etc. And we can support parents in fully understanding what their child's needs are and then help them to find the right educational provision so that their child gets back into the school setting. And certainly over the years, some of the feedback from parents that I've helped within the education sphere is that our work is life-changing for them. We give parents their lives back. And Rukhsana, you'll have many similar examples.
The actual stress and emotional trauma, in effect, that parents can suffer as a result of their child being out of school is quite high, really. And also you find that family dynamics change, because if your child's at home, a parent ends up having to give up a job, and that in itself can cause family issues because the income has halved, for instance, or certainly become lower, and one parent is out working and the other is actually just dealing with crisis after crisis with the child who's at home. We have examples of where children don't come out of their rooms, because their needs have been missed and the appropriate support hasn't been in place, and now they don't want to engage with anyone. And so all of these things add pressure to a family situation. I've certainly had in the past where families have said, look, if we don't sort this out, if we can't get our child back into education, we're going to end up separating because the stress of it all is just too much. Mothers often do end up having to give up their jobs. That in itself then ends up impacting on their mental health and well-being as well.
And I think where there's a role for someone like us is that we can either come in and be instructed to deal with all aspects of the SEN issues, or we can be instructed almost on a consultancy basis to provide specific advice in terms of what the issues might be that goes then into the family lawyer and they progress within the family law proceedings.
I've got two questions, and I think they're probably loaded questions, but I'm going to ask them anyway. The first is, there's an irony here, because rather like the courts system, and this isn't the forum to talk about that, special educational needs is under huge financial pressures and cuts, particularly in schools. My first question is, that must make this a hugely challenging area to work in.
It is a challenging area, but the actual law is very clear that once needs are identified and provision is necessary and it's put into an EHC plan, that becomes a legal document. Whatever the cost is, that provision has to be provided. Often we find that the actual EHC plan is very inadequate, and it doesn't include anything that really would make a difference to the child. But then you challenge it through the appeal to the SEND tribunal, and with the support like lawyers like us, you can make sure that the plan has meat on it, it has the provision, the support, the interventions that child needs, which are specific and quantified. And when you have all that in place, whether or not the local authority is facing challenges around resources, it still has to deliver it. And believe me, they do find the money, because often if you secure a suitable school for your child, which actually costs 40 grand a year, and it's in the plan, then that is what the local authority will have to pay for that child. I'm not saying that, everybody needs a school where they, need to be paying huge amounts of fees, but certainly the complexity of children with special needs these days mean that there is a lot of intervention and specialism needed, and that comes at a cost.
The law has not changed. The legal obligations on the local authority have not reduced as a result of their budgetary constraints. I think everybody has to have sympathy for the plight that local authorities find themselves in. But as I said in a recent meeting with a local authority team, including therapists, I don't care what resources you've got. I don't care whether you don't usually do it within your local authority. What I care about is the needs of this child and the responsibilities that you have to fulfill by virtue of the wording in the EHC plan.
You must come up against scenarios where that money simply isn't there. I mean, we read and hear about councils that are bankrupt.
I don't think councils are ever bankrupt. That is, I think that is not a true fact that's often bounced around. The government will always give them funding as and when needed. What it boils down to, local authorities tend to make it the fault of the parent or the child or the children with the SEN. It's not their issue. How the provision is funded should be raised with powers to be, not put onto the shoulders of the parent. And I have heard parents being told, well, actually, if you go for the cheaper version of this therapy or school, then we can give more children funding. Well, actually, I would say as a parent, I would only be interested in my child because you want to make sure they get the right provision so they can actually be able to be a functioning adult and be able to give back in society, not worry about other children and getting their provision. And the law is very clear. If the needs are identified, the provision must be provided no matter what the cost. The issue shouldn't be put on the shoulders of parents and families to make them feel bad. They should be supported so that their child can actually receive the provision they need.
The second question I had is around whether you as specialists are seeing an increase in the volume of this work. And I'm talking, and this is why I say it's a touch loaded, but I'm talking at a point in time when the whole nature of society is changing. We are much more in touch with special educational needs. We're much more in touch with things like autism and ADHD. So do you see that the number of referrals are on the increase, and therefore is your workload and the pressure on family practitioners increasing?
Certainly, there is more parents are aware, and actually, they about special educational needs and getting the right provision for their children, and actually then becoming aware that they have a right to challenge if they're not receiving that support through the tribunal, which has a phenomenal high success rate for parents, because it goes back to, you have a need, it has to have the provision, so the local authority has to fund it. There's lots of things that impact on, there are more and more children with SEN, more awareness of different conditions. I often see that a parent hasn't had the diagnosis themselves, but you're speaking to them and you can tell that they are displaying for instance, autism themselves, but they've never had a diagnosis. So more people are aware now of the different conditions, and they then want to make sure that their children are supported. And those with complex physical and learning needs are also, they are actually living longer in terms of health wise previously, maybe because medically they weren't able to live as long. The increase is there, and actually it helps that it is in the news more and more parents become aware of getting the right support for them, for their children, really.
I think I would echo that. And in particular, use Enable Law as an example. Until October 2023, they didn't have an SEN team. They now have an SEN team with one partner, one legal director, and 3 solicitors, plus a team of support staff. That there are a few reasons for the increase. Rukhsana's touched on some of those. Medical science in dealing with premature babies. We're seeing children perhaps born at 24, 25 weeks. Perhaps 20 years ago, they might not have survived. As medical science has advanced, those children are surviving, but they're surviving, and a significant proportion of them will have complex SEN.
Yeah.
And I think Rukhsana's touched on the point about children with complex medical needs, again, are perhaps surviving where they might not otherwise. I think the other reason is I have a lot of work from adoptive parents. Children are being left with their birth families, are being bounced from birth family into foster care, perhaps give the birth family another chance, they're bounced back to the birth family. Perhaps while they're in the care system, they might be moved between 4 or 5 different foster carers because of the pressure on foster carers and lack of resources. When those children are finally placed for adoption, and of course that's happening at an older age now, they are so traumatized, and they perhaps have had so many difficult experiences. They might have had fetal alcohol syndrome. They might have been exposed to drugs in utero. That leads to a child often with complex needs, including SEN. And I think there is a statistic from Adoption UK, or one of the adoption agencies, about the proportion of children who are adopted with SEN. I think the other contributing factor is the lack of resources, the complete breakdown of CAMS and mental health support for children. Perhaps if CAMS had not broken down in the way that it had, and a child who was struggling had early intervention, had the right package of support, it might not have escalated to the position whereby they might start to school refuse, they might not cope within the school setting. So I think you're absolutely right, David. A huge explosion in the volume of work in this area, but for a variety of different reasons.
COVID-19 also has, because children weren't in school, I think some parents have struggled to get their children to go back for various reasons, and that in itself has then led to more anxiety-related needs, which again, can't be addressed because of the limited resources available. And so you are ending up with children being at home without education, and parents finding out that actually there are things that the local authority should be doing to make sure that their child is receiving education, and not simply say, well, they've got a school, they're on a roll, they have to go back there. Sometimes you do feel like saying, well, come and live with that parent and see the effort that they put in to try and persuade their children to go to school, or child will go to school, and what they are faced with. I was speaking to somebody the other day, and they said it was about 10:30, and I asked her, is your son in school at the moment? And she says, no, not yet. I'm going to try after we finished our call. He hadn't gone in. He was going to go in, but he wasn't ready at that point to leave the house. So there's a lot going on, and I don't think necessarily schools are, and local authorities are actually understanding the anxiety that some children face, which is related to school. And a lot of us had anxiety after COVID-19 because we were going out into the world after being, shut in for a while. So, and why shouldn't the children have the same, really?
There's one final thing I want to touch on, which is, what does success look like? I can well imagine that this is a line of work where success can be pretty relative.
It is actually securing the appropriate provision for a child who has special educational needs, so that they actually thrive despite facing challenging family circumstances. They're in a school which is actually suitable for them. Also, it's about empowering parents and families with the knowledge and resources to advocate effectively for their children who have special needs, because often you find that parents who are raising concerns are seen as parents who are just demanding, and schools then will try and block them from contacting the teacher, etc., rather than actually sitting down with them to try and say, okay, so this hasn't worked, we'll try this for you with your child, or we will make an application for an EHC needs assessment. So parents, if they have clarity and support, they will feel more empowered to actually continue to fight for their children. If we're assisting them with an appeal to the SEND tribunal, is actually making sure that they have the right evidence to support the outcome that is needed for that child. And like I said before, the success rate with tribunals is actually, for parents, is very high. Although the tribunal has a higher level of appeals, it's probably nowhere near the numbers that could be challenged. So a lot of them probably aren't legally compliant. However, parents feel that because they've got the document, they feel that their child is now getting the support they need. Parents come back to us at various phases of education, and they will say, we are pleased that our son or daughter got into the school because it's made a huge difference to them. And then they're looking at, say, for post-16, something similar, so that they can make progress in the next phase of their education. And of course, EHC plans go up to 25, although they don't cover university. But in terms of colleges, you can continue to have a plan which then includes all the therapies that your child needs in order to be able to address their special needs. Often you say, local authorities will say, let's stop education now for the child or young person. They'll go into adult services and they're going to get therapies. They won't. They will not get that. And so it's better and for them if a lot of these interventions are actually available to them through the EHC plan process.
I think I would just add on that in terms of success, sometimes parents realise that there's an issue with their child's education, but they can't put their finger on what the problem is. And it's only when a team like us come on board that we can say, actually, we think it might be this. Why don't we send the child off to this expert to be assessed? And I think that's another measure of success. So many parents I will speak to, when I say, are you happy with your child's school? They'll say yes. And that's because they don't know that there's alternatives. They don't know that there are independent specialist schools for children with additional needs, perhaps for children with autism, children with cerebral palsy. And I think one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that when you're advising a parent in this situation, you're often taking that parent on a journey. Mm-hmm. Perhaps even the start of the journey is understanding what their child's needs are and perhaps getting a diagnosis. Then it's realising and securing an EHC plan for their child. Then it's finding the right specialist school. Then it's seeing their child be successful in school, maybe make a friend for the first time, maybe have a party invitation for a first time. So there's a range of different measures of success. We don't achieve positive outcomes for every family, but I think the majority of our cases, our families are left in a much better position in terms of the education of their children than when they started with us.
As I've said during the course of the discussion, what I tend to find with podcasts like this, where we're introducing slightly left field concepts into our listeners, I think there's a huge amount of work still to be done around education on the roles that people like you have to play in family proceedings. And it's through things like this, like podcasts, like articles on Today's Family Lawyer, that we can continue to do that. So I'm very, very grateful to you both for joining and for sharing your insights and expertise. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you. It's lovely to have met you, David.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Rukhsana and to Sarah. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.